right, let's turn this morning to the book of Ruth, chapter 2. Ruth chapter 2, we introduced the story, covered chapter 1 last week. We looked at the backstory of all these happenings. Ruth is introduced to us as the daughter-in-law of Naomi. Naomi and her husband, their family, have left Bethlehem, Judah during the time of a famine. Ended up in the land of Moab, where their two sons take wives. And over the course of time, both Naomi's husband and two sons die there in Moab. So chapter 1 brings us through the details of how Naomi and Ruth return back to the land of Bethlehem in Judah. And now is, chapter 1 ends with that great story of commitment, how Ruth won't leave Naomi's side. She's going to return to her land. Her people would be her people, her God, where she'll be buried. Ruth would also. And that's a great story of commitment, right? And that's a high for us from chapter 1. But life's about to get real hard, right? For you can imagine for them in that scenario. They're returning home with no husbands. They've been gone greater than 10 years now at this point. There's basically no assumption of anything but poverty ahead for them as they return home. Who knows what's happened to their land that's likely been mortgaged with the leaving and then with the death of Elimelech and all of his heirs. Life's about to get real hard. So chapter number 2, we're going to talk about hardworking Ruth and kind Boaz. Number 1, let's introduce Boaz. Introducing Boaz. Verse number 1, it says, "And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz." This is our first mention of him. He's mentioned here as a relative of Elimelech's. We're not sure how they are related. It's just noted for us that he's a kinsman of Elimelech's and that he's wealthy. Despite the famine, despite the events of the last 10 years, the Lord has blessed Boaz, and Boaz is considered to be a mighty man of wealth. "And Ruth the Moabitess," verse 2, "said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter." Ruth wants to take the initiative here, wants to go down and glean, wants to go and find a field where she can glean some ears of corn. Now, I'm going to have you read a couple of passages in the Old Testament here. In Leviticus chapter 19, there were some provisions in the Old Testament law for how to take care of the poor and needy. Okay? Leviticus 19. And verse number 9. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9. It says, "And when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field. Neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. Thou shalt not glean the vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God." So keep that in mind, especially there, verse number 9. It's going to come into play in our text. "When ye reap the harvest, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field." Okay? Turn over to Leviticus, a couple pages, chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22. Leviticus 23, verse 22, it says, "And when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not make clean riddance of the corners of thy field when thou reapest. Neither shalt thou gather any gleaning of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave them unto the poor and to the stranger. I am the Lord your God." So again, there's an added provision with that. Again, don't make clean riddance of the corners, and neither shalt thou gather any gleaning of the harvest. And one more, Deuteronomy chapter 24. Deuteronomy chapter 24. Verse 19. Deuteronomy 24, verse 19. And when thou cuttest down thine harvest in thy field, and hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thy hands. So what I've read there are some provisions that are in the Old Testament law for how they could supply and take care of the poor and needy. They were to cut corners. Literally, and not in the negative way that we use that phrase, right? They were to cut off a portion of the corner and not reap that. That there were portions that the Lord said, hey, when you harvest, why don't you cut your corner short a little bit and leave that extra for the poor and for the needy so that they could have some. And if you're gathering up and you drop some gleanings, Just drop it. Don't worry about picking up every kernel. Don't worry about picking up every grain, every stalk that may fall out of your gathering. Just leave it. And then if you've been out harvesting and you dropped something or you left something behind and you get back to the barn and you get back to the house and everything's put away and you realize, oh, well, I left a couple things out there. Just don't worry about it. Call it a day. Leave those things, right? Leave these for the poor, for the needy. It mentions the fatherless, the widow, and the stranger. Now, this was in a very real sense, a very wonderful way of helping the poor. It was a nice, we'd call it a social assistance program where the farmers could be commanded to be generous. They were not to be greedy. They were not to, collect every single piece off of their land. They didn't have to do that. They could leave corners of it. They could leave droppings. They could leave portions of it. So that it could command at the same time, while commanding farmers to be generous, it commands the poor to be active, to go out and to glean. The poor could just, they weren't going to be given these things, but they'd go out and they'd work for it. They'd go out and glean what the farmers and their servants had left behind. And there's a perfect balance there that is struck between generosity of those that have, and their command not to be greedy, and the ethic, the work ethic that's to be put forth by the others to go and to collect. It lets people provide for their needs and still, retain some dignity and not necessarily feel like a charity case. They can go out and work and they can have their needs provided for. No, they don't have a ton of land. No, they may not have much on their own, but they can go and they can work and they can glean and know that the farmers, out of their generosity, had left portions of their field unharvested. It's a really great program there. It really strikes the balance that we just see so many nations struggle with. It's just a great command. And that's what Ruth is getting at in chapter 2, verse number 2. When she comes to Naomi and she says, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. They are coming home. They're back in the Bethlehem, Judah. They're poor. Something's got to happen. Ruth's like, well, let me go. I'll go glean. That's kind of the idea behind gleaning in those fields. They would go and they would take the leftovers. They would take what hadn't been harvested. They would take what was dropped or what had been left behind. And Ruth is willing to do that. In verse 3 it says that she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. She took the initiative to do so. She shows a hardworking spirit. She returns with Naomi and she doesn't just stand around. She doesn't live in a life of expectation. She has that intuitive spirit. She has that hard-working initiative to go and to glean in these fields. And her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. Now, as God's providence had ordered, she came upon a field of a man named Boaz. Now, this is going to show you how God's providence is always at work. when it says that her hap was to do that, that's more than just saying, oh, it just so happened. There's more to it than that. If you believe in coincidences, you don't know much about providence, or as the Bible describes how God orders these things. You probably would think it's also a coincidence that the time that they returned to Judah at the end of chapter 1 says they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. Ruth and Naomi's life is more than one of coincidences. It's one which you can see that God has ordered, and God is writing a story out for us that Ruth is falling into her part quite well. God's providence is always at work. Sometimes in the negatives and sometimes in the positives. We've seen from the last couple of chapters a little bit of both. So don't mistakenly think that God's providence is only at work in your life when it's all good things that are happening. There could be times of trouble, there could be times of loss, there could be times of poverty, physically, mentally. That doesn't mean that God's not at work. That doesn't mean that you abandon all hope and think that God is forgotten. Verse number 4, it says, Behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered him, The Lord bless thee. So here again, we're introduced to Boaz. It's mentioned to us in verse number 1 who he is. And then verse number 4 shows us something of the good character of Boaz. Here's a man who's mighty in wealth, and yet it doesn't seem to have gone to his head. According to verse number 4, it appears that he's got a fairly good working relationship with his workers. He'll salute them, the Lord be with you, and they answer him, the Lord bless thee. That speaks well, right? That speaks well of people, that they have a good working relationship, even with people that might be considered their servants, their workers. We are left from verse 1 down through verse number 4 in this story of providence being introduced to Boaz, who is well off, and yet he's kind. He's thoughtful. Okay? Don't mistake how the Bible brings characters into light in this story. Now, number 2, let's begin with verse number 5. Number 2, Boaz meets Ruth. Boaz meets Ruth. It says in verse number 5 that, Then said Boaz unto his servant that was set up over the reapers, Whose damsel is this? Boaz notices this certain damsel working out in his field and questions who she is. Who's that? Who does she belong to? Not knowing the backstory, right? Not knowing that, she doesn't actually have a husband. Her husband is dead. She doesn't have a father-in-law. She, doesn't have a father in the land, doesn't have a father-in-law in the land. When he asks who this is, innocent question there, he has no idea of the backstory. And yet it says in verse 6, Then the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, It is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. That's who it is. So whoever this servant is in verse number 6 had also taken notice of Ruth. And apparently, and you're actually going to see it spelled out for us in this passage, Ruth makes a very good impression in her effort and her work ethic and what they've been gleaning in the field. The servant also saw this. The servant had previously asked questions. Long before Boaz comes on the scene, this servant that's in charge of the reapers sees this and begins to ask questions, finds out the details about her. It says there in verse 7, She said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. Now Ruth may not have known it, but this servant had been watching her. And he had been impressed by her. She worked hard. She wasn't lazy. She didn't expect a bunch to be handed to her. She got out there and she worked. She asked for permission to work, and then when she did, He says there in verse number 7, she came, she hath continued even from the morning until now. Man, she's been here all day. She's been out there. She's been working hard all day. I like what it says in verse number 7. It's just something that made an impression, right? That she tarried a little in the house. Now, the barn or the farmhouse or whatever is intended there by that phrase house, it stuck out to the servant over the reapers that, Ruth, at break time, she doesn't take nearly as long of breaks, right? When others go to get in the shade for a while or take a little bit of respite to get out of the heat of the day, to take a break, she doesn't tarry long there. She just tarried. Like she's been here all day. She's been out there all day working hard. Like she's been working real hard. She's a really good worker, and she's that gal that came back with Naomi from Moab. She's Moabitish, and yet she's been out here, and I got to say, she kind of stands out. She's working hard. She's been here. Verse number 8. Boaz, equally impressed by all that he's heard, goes out to meet her. Verse number 8. Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. When Boaz hears all of this from his servant, he goes out to meet her and encourages her and wants her to stay. Hey, you have a place here. I'll always make sure that you've got a field to glean. From here on out, don't worry about going into other fields. Don't go according to verse number 8, and go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go into the vessels and drink of that which the young men have drawn. Now, there's a lot of blessings here in this passage. There's a lot of things here from Boaz to Ruth. He mentions, of course, not to go into another field, but he was going to provide for her even above the grain and the corn, even beyond probably what she came to get. He promises her a few things here in these verses. First of all, he promises her companionship, right? Here's this gal that's come back from Moab with her mother-in-law. Who knows if she knows anybody? Who knows if she has any friends? Who knows if she has any acquaintances? I tell you what, why don't you hang around here around my maidens? From now on, you stick in my fields and you abide here fast by my maidens. Okay? The other gals here, my gals, my maidens, my workers here, I want you to stick close to them. Okay? I want you to stick close to them. And there would have been a level of companionship, acquaintance, potentially even ultimately friendship that could have gathered from that. And that's a huge blessing. He also promised her protection. Verse number 9, have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? This probably would have been a fear, right? Or at least a cause of caution or concern. You've got a young woman that's out there, and as word spreads around that she's not married, does that, do folks start to hassle her? Do folks start to, catcall her? What happens, right? What happens when, guys get out in the field and they see this young woman and she's single, she's unattached, and is there worry there? Well, Boaz says, don't worry. I'll make sure that nobody will touch you. Don't worry about the men. I've already instructed them. You're off limits. They're not going to touch you. Don't worry about that at all. And so he promises her protection. And then he promises her provision in the last part of verse number 9. When thou art athirst, go unto the vessels and drink of that which the young men have drawn. And that's, again, a blessing. We're talking about going beyond, right? This is beyond the provision. This is more generous than what Leviticus 19 requires of Boaz, isn't it? No denying it. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, there are requirements for what Boaz, as a wealthy landowner, should do with his land and the portions that he should leave for the widows, for the poor, and less well off. None of those things, none of the things from verse number 8 and verse number 9 are required. This bringing her in close to be with his particular female servants, the promise, the word that he's already sent out to his young men, hey, she's off limits, don't approach her, don't give her a hard time, don't touch her. And then actually being able to bring her in close to the refreshing part. And when it's time to come in for a drink, I would assume that during that time there was a different place allotted for the poor and the stranger and the widow and those that were gleaning, as opposed to the house servants or the particular servants of Boaz. And he wants to make sure that she's taken care of like she's one of the servants, even if she's not. And so great blessings there in that passage. So what he has heard about Ruth has certainly made an impression on him. How you live means something, right? When people watch you and they hear your story, and he's heard about Ruth, the relationship that she has with Naomi, it's probably been told now of her commitment when she came back and all the effort that she's put forth to be a good daughter-in-law and be a blessing and a help to Naomi. Not only that, because that's family to him, he's also heard that she's got character, right? She works hard, she's kind. All of these things matter, okay? And people take notice of those things. Ruth probably went out that day. It seems like she was just trying to work to take care of herself and Naomi. And yet by the effort that she put forth, by the kindness of her heart toward her mother-in-law, by the effort that she puts forth, people noticed that. Right? And so she probably didn't know that they noticed that, and yet they did. So if you have any questions or any worries about working hard and wondering if people will notice, people do notice. Okay? People notice those things. Brother John is a manager there at NISC. He could explain that to you. He could show you that people that work hard, those things are noticed. They really are. Verse number 10, then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? Now this is the appropriate response to grace, right? And this just further goes to show the character of someone like Ruth. There would be a lot of people that in this situation, their response might be, yeah, well, I'm glad you finally noticed, right? I've been out here, I've been working hard. Finally, somebody noticed the effort that I put forth, right? Why? She doesn't do that. Like, her question is not, why not? Her question is, why me? Why are you showing such grace? Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, a stranger? Like she's not necessarily confused as much as she's wondering, like, why would you show such favor to me? That is a humble attitude. That is a humble approach, even in the face of blessing, to not question, why didn't this come sooner? Or, I deserve this. Man, I left my homeland and I'm taking care of my mother-in-law and I'm out here from sun up to sundown working myself ragged. It's about time somebody noticed. She's like, I thank you for noticing. I didn't know anybody was paying attention. And I'm not sure what I've done to earn such favor. Seeing that I'm a stranger, like, I'm not even Jewish. Like, I can't believe that he's showing such kindness to me. Verse 11, and Boaz answered and said unto her, it hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thy husband, and how thou left thy husband and thy mother and the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knewest not heretofore. Ruth learns what Boaz already knows. Long before Ruth knew Boaz, Boaz knew about Ruth. He had asked questions. He had inquired to find out about her. And that's a blessing, right? That reminds us of our Savior, our Redeemer, knowing us long before we knew him. The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Boaz recognizes the spiritual end of her decision as well, right? When he talks about knowing what she had done for her mother-in-law and the impact of that decision, he realizes that it's more than just a personal commitment. It was a spiritual commitment as well. When she said, thy God shall be my God, back in chapter number 1, you learn that other people see the intensity of that commitment, that you have come to trust. Under whose wings, the God of Israel, thou art come to trust. You know, that picture of that bird that goes to rest and trust under the wings of its mother. This is a phrase, right, that's going to be used by Boaz's and Ruth's descendants someday. You know, when you read in the Psalms and David uses that phrase about coming to trust in the shadow of thy wings or resting under his wings, that's not original with David, right? That's not a phrase that he coined. That's a story of his heritage. That's a story long implanted in his mind and heart about what it means to trust God. Verse number 13, and she said, let me find favor in thy sight, for that thou hast comforted me, and for that thou hast spoken friendly unto thy handmaid, though I be not like unto one of thy handmaidens. That's about the most polite and gracious reception and word of thanks that you can give. The recognition of who she was, and yet this extension of this kindness, she is certainly grateful and thankful for it. Now, number 3, Boaz, favor to Ruth. Verse 14, it says, and Boaz said unto her, at mealtime come thou hither. Now, this is where the story kind of starts to ramp up a little bit, because this is where it goes beyond the treatment of just a stranger or a foreigner or someone that is gleaning in his fields. In verse number 14, there's actually this getting of a bit closer. It says in verse 14, at mealtime come thou hither, and eat of the bread, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar. And she sat beside the reapers, and he reached her parched corn, and she did eat, and was sufficed, and left. She's a bit closer now. When she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not. Again, another extension that is more... this is going beyond the requirements of Leviticus chapter 19. This is going beyond the bare minimum. It's okay to do that, right? In our efforts for the Lord, it's okay to go beyond the bare minimum. If there's certain things that we're required to do, you got to do those things. But it's okay. It can be, you know, it's kind and worthwhile to even go beyond those minimums. And let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean them, and rebuke her not. This is a way to, again, bless her, not necessarily, certainly not dishonor her dignity, make her a charity case, none of those things at all. But this is a way to provide for her, to extend his well wishes, and to extend his kind heart to Ruth, to give her that extra on purpose, to intentionally leave good portions that she could glean and receive. It's a blessed day, right? We're not sure that chapter 2 didn't just take place. It sounds like all this takes place in one day, right? All of these events taking place maybe in just one day. Let's close here. Number 4, Ruth and Naomi. It says in verse 18 that she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she brought forth and gave to her that she had reserved after she was sufficed. Even when she was in the house eating bread and she was sufficed, she She kept a portion, right? She's always thoughtful, always thinking about, what she could do, she could take home. When she left that meal, she went actually back out into the field to glean more in the evening. Ruth is just a good character all the way around. And her mother-in-law said unto her, Where hast thou gleaned today? And where wroughtest thou? Blessed be he that did take knowledge of thee. And she showed her mother-in-law with whom she had wrought, and said, The man's name with whom I wrought today is Boaz. When Naomi sees the haul, right, that she brings back, she's like, where have you been? Like, this don't make no sense. There's no way Naomi expected her to come back with this much. The only explanation in Naomi's mind is, this was on purpose. Someone saw you, right? Somebody took knowledge of you. There's no way that you should have come back with this much. And that portion that you brought back from that, like, where'd you get that? That's the question. Like, somebody took knowledge of you, didn't they? And the answer is yes. And she mentions there in verse number 19, the man's name, his name was Boaz. And Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, The man is near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. Now you already know that, right? Now, Naomi is not necessarily just repeating a truth that he's a relative. She's got something more in mind. It says there in verse number 20 that she recognizes his kindness not just to the living but to the dead. There is a thought here of Elimelech and his family, and there's wheels that start spinning in Naomi's mind. It all circles around that word kinsman. Now, I mentioned to you last week the Old Testament provisions that would allow for a man's name and his land and his inheritance to be kept in the family by the duties of his brother and whatnot. Now, Elimelech doesn't seem to have that. And yet, there are other provisions, and we don't have time to read all of them. I'll introduce them really quickly. Leviticus chapter 25. What if the guy doesn't have a brother, right? That's what Deuteronomy dealt with, what a brother was supposed to do. But what if he doesn't have a brother? Well, let's just highlight a couple verses here. Leviticus 25, verse 25. Leviticus 25, verse 25. If thy brother be waxen poor and hath sold away some of his possession, and if any of his kin come to redeem it, then shall he redeem that which his brother sold. If the man have none to redeem it, and himself be able to redeem it, then let him count the years of the sale thereof, and restore the overplus unto the man to whom he sold it, that he may return unto his possession. Verse number 47, let's skip down again, just for sake of time. And if a sojourner or stranger wax rich by thee, and thy brother that dwelleth by him wax poor, and sell him unto the stranger or sojourner by thee, to the stock of the stranger's family, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him. Either his uncle or uncle's son may redeem him, or any that is nigh of kin unto him of his family may redeem him. Provisions start to kick in where, okay, what if a man doesn't have a brother? Well, the law would still allow for next of kin, right? Other kinsmen in the family to redeem his inheritance, to redeem his property, to redeem his possessions. And Naomi knows that. And that's the intent. That is the idea when she says that he is a kinsman. She's not just repeating the facts of verse number 1. She's not just saying he's a close relative. Her idea is that, wait a minute, this is how the Lord's going to work in redeeming Elimelech's, right? Boaz's kindness, not just to the living, but to the dead. He is of near kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. And so she begins to think, and the wheels start to spin with Naomi. And the thought process is kind of already laid there that this might go somewhere. this could go somewhere. Verse 21, let's just close out the chapter reading. And Ruth the Moabitess said, he also said unto me, thou shalt keep fast by my young men until they have ended all my harvest. And Naomi said unto Ruth, her daughter-in-law, oh, it is good, my daughter, that thou go out with his maidens, that they meet thee not in any other field. Then you stay. You don't leave. You stick right there in Boaz's field. So she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of the barley harvest and of the wheat harvest, and dwelt with her mother-in-law. God's providence is at work in this story. You know, when Ruth went out to glean that day, Naomi had no idea where she might end up. And yet when she comes home with enough evidence that someone has taken notice. Someone has been gracious and blessing her with this abundance. And then the name Boaz comes up. And the wheels start spinning for Naomi that's one of our, not just kin, our kinsmen. And she knows that this could very well go somewhere. And Ruth, you do what he said. You don't leave. You stay in his field. Whatever he said, you do that. She's got plans. She's got thoughts. And we'll see him put into practice next time. Father, we're thankful to come today. We are thankful for your word. I pray that you bless us as we